to the Scholars Forum in the Catholic Intellectual Tradition for the spring semester of 2022. The forum consists of faculty talking about their recently published or soon to be published books related in one way or another with the Catholic intellectual tradition. It takes place on Teams, usually every few weeks on Wednesday at 4 p.m. And the forum is sponsored by the University Core, the Catholic Studies Program, the Catholic Studies Center, the Department of Religion, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. It is an exciting expression of harvesting our treasures, and our faculty scholars truly are among those treasures. Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, "A university is a reproductive organ of cultural community. Its constitutive endowment lies not in buildings or equipment, civil status or revenues, but in the intellectual life of its professors. Its central function is the communication of intellectual development." For this opening talk, falling appropriately on Ash Wednesday, the start of the Lenten season of self-examination and reflection, we are so pleased to have as our speaker Dr. Tom Rzeznik of the History Department and who also teaches in the Core in Catholic Studies. Dr. Rzeznik will be presenting on his recent book, The Cambridge Companion to American Catholicism, co-edited with Margaret McGinnis. And in his talk tonight, Dr. Rzeznik will be focusing particularly on the contributions of women in the church. So it's very appropriate for Women's History Month, appropriate for the church as she examines herself on this holy day that's sort of dedicated to that. I want to mention that there will be time for Q&A at the end of the session, and our own Maribel Andrau, Assistant Director of the Core, will be coordinating the questions, which can be given either verbally by raising a hand or in the chat. I am now very happy to turn it over to Dr. Tom Rzeznik.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that very kind introduction. I'm very glad that you didn't say that it's fitting that it's Ash Wednesday and this is your penance to get us started. No, it's really nice to be able to be with everybody to talk about the book, and it is a sort of a fitting day as a moment of self-reflection, as you said, Nancy. So I'm going to be talking to you about this volume, the Cambridge Companion to American Catholicism. And in some ways, this talk will be a little bit different from some of the others in the series because I can't talk about it as my book or talk about my argument, since I served as the co-editor of the volume. So it's really a reflection of the work of 19 scholars and their contributions to our understanding of the history of American Catholicism. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about the project as a whole, what the book aimed to accomplish, some of the points of distinctions, challenges that we faced, and some of the things I learned, and then sort of to cycle a little bit into my own research on the history of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City and the work of the Sisters of Charity in building up Catholic healthcare in the United States, which is incredibly appropriate for this moment as we begin Women's History Month. So the Cambridge Companion volume came about when Cambridge University Press approached us, my co-editor Margaret McGinnis of LaSalle University in Philadelphia, to ask us to undertake a volume on American Catholicism, because the Cambridge Companion series is extensive, covering all aspects of religion, ancient, modern, U.S., global, and they had volumes on American Quakerism, on American Judaism, but they had no volume on American Catholicism, and they recognized that that was a tremendous gap in the series. So they'd reached out to us because the two of us had experience as co-editors of American Catholic Studies, which is a quarterly journal published by the American Catholic Historical Society in Philadelphia. So Maggie and I have both, Maggie was the previous editor of American Catholic Studies, and I've taken over since 2013, serving as the co-editor of that volume. It was also beneficial that both Maggie and I regularly teach undergraduate classes on the history of American Catholicism. So we approach the volume with that in mind. You know, what would we want our students to gain from such a volume? We were given free range to shape the volume as we saw fit, as long as we kept to 120,000 words, which made for some decisions and discussions about what to include and how to shape the volume. It was Maggie and I who laid out a map for the chapters and recruited the authors, and every chapter is new to the volume. It's not recycled material. And the book sort of falls in between. It's not quite a textbook, but it's also not an edited volume. So it's not focused on a particular author's research specialization, their own narrow research focus. We asked them to write sort of broad chapters that would serve as an introduction to their particular topic. So whether it's the history of sort of Catholic and politics or the history of Catholic art and culture, they were asked to sort of, in 7,000 to 8,000 words, provide a broad foundation. As I mentioned, for our audience, we were thinking about our own students, but also non-specialists in the field. And we sort of asked ourselves, what would we want if we were to pick up the Cambridge volume on sort of Islam, or the Cambridge companion volume on American Judaism? It needs to be able to communicate it to those who are not part of the tradition, those who don't have current sort of background knowledge on the topic. So we sort of told our authors that if it's something you have to explain to your students, a term or a concept, you're going to need to explain it in the volume. You can't take that knowledge for granted. And we very much want the book to be read as a whole. You can certainly pick it up and read it cover to cover, but it's also a volume where people can extract individual chapters. And that also reflects something about what Cambridge saw in the volume itself, that as much as they want people to buy the books, this is part of the Cambridge core portal. So Seton Hall subscribes to it. People can go in and find the chapter that they need, download that particular chapter. And in time, Cambridge Press is going to be able to give us all sorts of data analytics on which chapter was the most downloaded, which had the most page views, which is a very kind of different way about thinking about a publication, where you're thinking about downloads, not book sales. So you sort of it then also shapes the way we were thinking about the volume. In terms of the book, we had a couple central themes or principles that we wanted to capture, or things that influenced the way we were thinking about the subject. The first is that Catholicism is the largest single religious denomination in the United States since the 1840s, 1850s. And because of that, it's deserving of historical attention, and it's deserving of sort of attention of an American audience, not just a Catholic audience. Catholics were here shaping the development of the United States since the very beginning, since sort of the age of European exploration. We also wanted to make sure that we captured the diversity of the Catholic experience, recognizing that American Catholicism is the most internally diverse religious community in the United States, diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, in terms of social class, education level. All sorts of areas of diversity are part of the Catholic story, and how the Church has been shaped by that diversity and at times struggled with that diversity. And then finally, we were hoping to capture some of the many paradoxes in American Catholicism. That the U.S. Catholicism is a church that is both growing and contracting. It is unified but polarized, global in scale, but hyper-local at times. It is also sort of very much Roman, but distinctively American. How do we tell a narrative that captures some of that dynamism that has been one of the sort of defining elements of the faith tradition in the United States? So with that in mind, we then mapped out the chapters. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is a historical overview, 3 chapters that sort of provide just broad chronological discussions. One deals with, the first chapter is basically sort of the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century. So the first Catholics, the immigrant church era, and the Catholic century, so the 20th century, playing off the idea of the American century. And we kind of played around with periodization. We didn't want it to be sort of Vatican II as the dividing point. We wanted Vatican II to be part of the story of the Catholic Church, say, in the 20th century. So the first two chapters provide the chronological overview. The next set of chapters deal with thematic topics. So we sort of looked at topics. There's a chapter on Catholic education, a chapter on women religious, a chapter on politics, social welfare, gender and sexuality, art and culture. And then the final section deals with what we called the many faces of Catholicism, talking about diversity. Okay, hope that's not on my end. But that idea of the many faces of Catholicism was sort of a way of talking about sort of a chapter on lay women, a chapter on Black Catholics, a chapter on Latino Catholics, a chapter on Asian American Catholics, and a chapter on cultural Catholics as sort of a new variable within the American Catholic story. And for that, I kind of sort of very much shaped by perhaps sort of my own experiences here in sort of at Seton Hall and sort of the sort of northern New Jersey. When you look around the Catholic Church, it is no longer simply sort of the white European model. That is not the face of our Catholic student body here. That's not the face of the worshiping community at the local parishes. So we wanted to make sure that we were sort of mindful of the many groups that contribute to the Catholic story. You know, and then sort of looking back, of course, there were some gaps. We weren't able to cover everything. So sort of there isn't a chapter on, say, Native American Catholics. There isn't a chapter on sort of new religious movements like Focus and Egidio, you know, all of those things. But with any sort of volume, decisions had to be made, and the work continues. So I'm happy to talk sort of more about those sorts of specifics when we get into move towards the Q&A. But the last thing sort of to leave with, going back to the point that Nancy made about Women's History Month, to maybe talk a little bit more about, you know, sort of turning attention to me and the research that I'm currently doing. A few years ago, sort of right now I'm doing research on sort of St. Vincent's Hospital and the Sisters of Charity, which I got pulled into that research project when St. Vincent's Hospital closed, and I was curious about sort of how it came to be that New York City no longer has a Catholic hospital. And I wanted to sort of go into that institutional history. But with that project, recognizing it as an institutional history and the history of Catholic healthcare, I cannot tell that story without focusing on the work of the Sisters of Charity, the community of women religious that was founded by our own Mother Seton, that our university takes its name from. And so sort of looking at the history of the hospital is really a story of the work of the Sisters of Charity, who founded the institution, who raised funds for the institution, who administered the institution, who sat on its board of directors and trustees, who headed every single major department of the hospital, who instilled the institution with their own spirit and charism and created something unique. And so I really come to appreciate their work in ways that sort of many people I don't think fully appreciate. I mean, those of us with sort of familiarity with Catholic history know that Catholic sisters have made immeasurable contributions to the building up of the Catholic Church, that they were often the public face of Catholicism because of their work in education and healthcare. Often sort of being at the front lines in terms of epidemics, from the cholera epidemic of the 1830s and the 1840s. And in the case of St. Vincent's, they were on the front lines of the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. So thinking about their work, one, it's a remarkable story because it's so well documented. Sisters kept impeccable records of every decision that was made at the institution, although it can sometimes be frustrating because they never talked about themselves. They never wanted to give credit to themselves for the accomplishments that they achieved. And often they were too busy doing things to sit down and reflect and write about their experiences. So even though we know that they responded heroically to the cholera epidemic, there's almost no remaining archival evidence where they described their experience caring for cholera victims, simply because they were too busy. But how was it that the Sisters of Charity started out in 1849 in a rented townhouse with 30 beds, without running water, without heat. And from that foundation built up St. Vincent's to be the largest Catholic hospital in the United States by the 1950s, where they managed sort of staffs of of thousands, where they sort of basically ran a multi-million-dollar enterprise and industry, where they worked to shape healthcare in the United States and its values, where they negotiated with government, where they sort of made real estate purchases and had to fight to secure their interests in a very competitive New York City real estate market. They were savvy entrepreneurs. So kind of thinking about women religious in healthcare isn't just about sort of sisters as nurses. It's sisters as administrators, sisters as trustees. And often within the history of healthcare, they are, sort of the lone women in spaces that were dominated by men and coded as male, sort of within a world of doctors. At St. Vincent's, the doctors had to answer to the sisters. They were the ultimate authority. For as long as they were running the hospital, managing it, paying the salaries, they got to call the shots, which does not fit into the story of American healthcare and American medicine, which is generally a story of doctors and scientists. And so studying Catholic history makes us question those assumptions and call attention to the amazing work that they have done. Sort of a few years ago, I was asked to write sort of an essay on why I study women religious. It was a very short essay for the newsletter of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame. And I wrote at the time that sort of studying the Sisters of Charity made me more mindful of the corporate activities of women religious and their role in building, sustaining, and managing the institutional life of the church. And that it calls attention to the work of women religious, not just as nurses and caregivers, but it sort of, the history of St. Vincent's allows me to highlight the sisters' ability to carve out space and create structures that enable them to live out their vocation and advance the church's social mission. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to accomplish with the project, to tell the story of the hospital, but also give due credit to the Sisters of Charity for their remarkable work. So that was about my 15 minutes that I was allotted, but I hope that we can have a conversation about the Cambridge Companion volume, about the Sisters of Charity, about St. Vincent's Hospital, or anything that might be on people's minds. So thanks, Nancy, for this opportunity.
Well, Tom, that was so interesting and really just so provocative. I know St. Vincent's Hospital because I used to go there. We lived in the village for a while, and also we had friends who lived right across from the street, so across the street from it. So it's really fascinating to me. So let's open it up for questions, and Maribel will, kind of be the moderator. So thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Stockdale.
Thank you, Maribel.
Monsignor Radano, can you please mute yourself?
How do I do that?
That's a good question. Now you're good.
Okay.
You're signing in two. You just mute one. I don't know what is that supposed to mean, but thank you.
Thanks, Monsignor. And Tom,
ahead,
thank
Tom.
you so much. I so appreciate that, and I'm glad I was able to be a part of this today. You mentioned in your introduction to the companion series that you would be talking about some of the things that you learned personally along the way, and that just really struck me as something that I'd be curious to know. Just kind of as you were pulling this together, getting articles from colleagues, anything surprise you as far as what you received? Anything that you perhaps were unaware of or didn't expect in some of the articles that were submitted? Or anything as a whole that, as you looked at as a whole, was something you stood back from and said, "Oh wow, I didn't expect to see that."
Yeah, in some ways, since it is designed as a bit of a primer for American Catholicism, there weren't. It wasn't about here the path-breaking scholarship where it's a book driven by one central argument, but certainly sort of enmeshed in it, it made me have to think about some of the basics. And so when we were shaping the volume, kind of looking at some other volumes that have been put together, it made me think about sort of what are they missing that we could do? So one thing that we did at the very beginning of the volume, after the chronological chapters, we inserted 2 chapters, one dealing with Catholic worship and prayer life, and one dealing with the Catholic intellectual tradition. Thinking about those who may not know anything about Catholicism. So what is this Catholic intellectual tradition? And the author of that chapter had to try and figure out how to explain a concept like natural law in a nice, succinct paragraph. To sort of say, here's how Catholics are thinking about God, the world, themselves, that's distinctive. A chapter on worship that, perhaps even those who themselves, readers who themselves are Catholic and have experience with Mass, the sacraments, devotional activities, we wanted them to be able to recognize that things weren't always the way they are now. So what was Catholic worship like in Mother Seton's day, in the kind of the early U.S. Church? What was it like in the pre-Vatican II era? And so getting into some of those issues. Some of the other stuff that I thought was very sort of to some extent eye-opening to me or helpful to me. The authors who helped us write those chapters on the many faces of Catholicism. We had 2 authors we had sort of 2 scholars who co-authored the chapter on Latinx Catholics. And, for me, it's one of the best 8,000-word overviews of the Latino Catholic experience in the United States that I know of. So it's great to be able to have this and ready to go and give to people. A chapter on Asian American Catholics that tries to talk about the Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American, Filipino American, and sort of mapping out sort of distinctiveness within those groups, but also sort of shared sort of experiences as Asian American Catholics. So being able to hand that over to people who might be looking for a foundational discussion. And then finally, the one that was probably the most interesting and unique was the one on cultural Catholics, because we asked, sort of how do you sort of it's a new group, but it's also kind of an amorphous group. So how do you bring that all together? And the author of that chapter does a very nice job parsing the terms. Sort of what do we, sort of how do we describe this group? What are the strengths and weaknesses of describing them as nuns, NONES? What about lapsed Catholics? What about, what does it mean to be a cultural Catholic? Or sort of a secular Catholic, the equivalent of people who talk about secular Jews. So it talks about sort of the pluses and minuses of these various categories and it sort of shows how we're trying to figure out how to speak about a sort of a generation that it's not that they're not religious. They're maybe just not tied to institutions or an institutional church in the way that previous generations were. So that sort of that aspect of the chapter was very helpful to sort of frame the discussion and frame the debates and sort of get us to say, hey, we have to be mindful of the very labels we're using.
Yeah, good, Tom. Thank you. Just can I ask a follow-up before Maribel? I'm sorry. Would you mind if I asked a follow-up if before we turn it to Elizabeth? That's okay, Elizabeth? Okay, great. Tom, no, you were just talking and that category of kind of the cultural Catholics, just and the many faces of Catholicism. Was there anything around ecumenism in the volume, or at least maybe Catholic Protestant conversations in the United States? Anything like that, or tensions perhaps even?
Yeah, I mean, sort of in a way that sort of lots of topics get, a paragraph here, a paragraph there. So certainly the chronological overview that deals with sort of the Vatican II era, but even like the suburbanization of Catholicism, pre-Vatican II, where suddenly Catholics are moving into the suburbs, and there's that sort of backyard ecumenism that takes place as they move out of sort of immigrant enclaves in cities to sort of suddenly like, oh, we now have Jewish and Protestant neighbors. They don't seem all that bad. Same way the chapter on the Catholic intellectual tradition deals with kind of, in a way, kind of not just ecumenism with, Catholic Protestants, Catholic Jews, but also kind of the internal kind of Catholic ecumenism that emerges within theological discussions when it's not simply sort of a sort of European white male conversation shaping theology, that, sort of theology in the sort of in, kind of the past generation has been shaped by global voices, by sort of theology programs that are training men, women of all sorts of backgrounds, and they are now entering into theological conversations. There's a way that it's not the same ecumenism that you're talking about, but there is a way that we can think about that as sort of a Catholic ecumenism as well.
Go ahead, Dr. Redwine. You're muted.
So interesting. And I have to say, like, here's my big question. So I also study women from about 100 years ago who were theater performers and doers and activists. And I wish I could go back in time. And I feel like I heard some of this in your voice and say, like, could you just keep a little more of a diary? Like, I know you're busy. I know you had a lot. I know you were doing all the time. But, I'll never forget Axel in one of his presentations in this fall said, it's all about what gets written down. So trying to, like, for me, it's reading letters about these people sometimes. So I just, like, I'm looking for research help. If you're studying a subject where you want to reclaim their role, and partly because of the way they did their role so well and they were working so much, they weren't, the equivalent of like posting it about themselves all the time on social media, but they weren't like they weren't keeping as much of a record. So I'm just curious about how you ended up finding out all about that, because that is so interesting and new to me, that the nuns were kind of running, were the people in power. That is just fascinating. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. I mean, going into the history, sort of trying to, when I was working at things like the cholera epidemic and trying to find like that firsthand account, struggling. It's like, it has to be somewhere. And then at one point in the archives, I came across a letter from 1918, 1920, where somebody was researching in the midst of the sort of the flu epidemic. Somebody asked about how the sisters responded to cholera. And the sister at the time, sort of said, I'm sorry, we just don't have this material. The sisters were simply too busy working. And sort of like, oh, okay, like they even recognized this issue. I will say, like, the hospital is a little bit different because to some extent it may not be their first-hand accounts, their diaries, but they kept great institutional records. They had to, as the managers of the hospital, they met quarterly, monthly. I have the records of the meetings, kind of in beautiful script, which makes it very easy to read, where they're keeping track of all of these finances. They're making the formal decisions on hiring, on real estate purchases. Sometimes the sort of like taking department minutes of department meetings. Some are extensive, some barely say anything, but it gives you a sense of their voice and how they operated. To the point that, like, later on in the 1950s, when they brought in, I'm sorry, a little bit earlier, but when they brought in, starting in the 1920s, sort of male business elites as an advisory council, they were very clear. They're communicating to the archbishop, telling the archbishop to remind the men on the advisory council that their role is strictly advisory and they have no formal authority, because these were people who had been accustomed to, sort of sitting on corporate boards, or looked at their Protestant peers at St. Luke's Hospital or Columbia or other places where they were the ones in charge. And, the sisters were very mindful of protecting their sphere of authority. Both against sort of business interests, but also the medical doctors, the medical board. They let the doctors make, they were in charge of medical decisions, but the sisters ultimately took care of sort of the hospital policies. And so in the end, even though I don't have their diaries, what I have to recognize is that the institution speaks for the sisters. The policies that they put in place, the decisions that they made to sort of shape the institution, what to prioritize, the investment that they made in making sure that the public wards were of the same quality as the private pavilion that they built, that they were not going to shortchange the charity patients that they were dedicating to caring for. So there's a way that, sort of all good research, you sometimes have to work with what you have, read between the lines. and find their voices and vision in other ways. And so, for me, the building itself, the policies, but even the architecture, the budget as kind of a document sort of showing what they valued. So those kinds of things are part of the story and part of the kind of the fun challenge of doing this type of research, where as a historian, I can't create documents, I can't survey people, I can't interview people from 150 years ago. So you work with what you have.
That's really helpful. I have like a million other questions, but I'll let you ask questions too.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Dr. Enright.
Well, thank you, Maribel. I like Elizabeth. I have a couple of questions, but what you were talking about with the sisters really interested me so much, and I was thinking about, oddly enough, how these sisters are like medieval abbesses in certain ways. Like we just taught in the core Hildegard of Bingen, and she was an abbess in the 12th century, and they had tremendous authority. That for women at that time it was huge compared to most women at that time, and I think that's really, really interesting. And as you said, like the decisions of the hospital reflected the values of these women as Catholic women. And I think that even though they didn't keep diaries, it reflects their perspective. And and I was wondering, I know we have talked about, and I went to some of that lecture about the AIDS epidemic. That was a really crucial time in New York City in the 80s and at St. Vincent's. And if you could just speak to a little bit about how the values of the sisters shaped their response to the AIDS epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sort of, St. Vincent's to some extent had no choice but to respond to the AIDS crisis, given their location in Greenwich Village, which was sort of ground zero for the AIDS epidemic. So they had to respond when patients were sort of showing up at their doorstep, being brought in by the ambulance. And the early days of the AIDS crisis, AIDS was a death sentence. And so the sisters the sisters made a commitment to caring for these people. And what I find interesting is sort of as they're trying to do it, in some ways they're just sort of, taking up the work, that you're sort of trained to do and then almost sort of think about it later. But as they talked about the AIDS crisis, the sisters themselves sort of went back to the early history of the hospital, and they spoke about it as part of a sort of a long-standing chain, a long-standing commitment, that the same way they responded to sort of cholera patients and the famine Irish, to treating the sick and the dying with dignity, with respect, caring for all regardless of their financial means. That became a way of for them to understand the AIDS crisis and what they were doing. And so the sisters who were involved, they sort of will speak about both sort of the commitment of Elizabeth Ann Seton, the commitments established by their predecessors within the Sisters of Charity of New York. So, to some extent it was new, but they read it through that long history of commitments. And even though by the 1980s, 1990s, this number of Sisters of Charity within the hospital were much fewer than they had been, the sisters still controlled sort of key appointments within the hospital and were able to sort of shape commitments. It was one sister, Sister Patrice Murphy in particular, who took the hospice program and retooled it to serve AIDS patients and had to sort of lobby, sort of joining others to lobby for changes in Medicare law, because sort of a hospice program was to care for patients in their homes. But these sort of the AIDS patients sort of often didn't have anybody to care for them or were too sick to be properly cared for in their homes. So they had to fight to get they renamed the program. They didn't call it a hospice, they called it a supportive care program, but they basically fought to get sort of hospice funding towards AIDS patients, often for sort of extensive lengths of stay. So, those sort of things, there were still enough of them, and they were willing to not just serve those in need, but but advocate for them. Sisters at sort of a separate group of sisters up at St. Clair's advocated for those who were dying with AIDS in New York City prisons, and had the hospital sort of had dedicated AIDS wards for incarcerated AIDS patients. And so there's a degree of commitment and heroism involved in those stories.
Thank you. That, I find that part of it very inspiring, because so many people were afraid to work with AIDS.
Yeah, and there's stories of patients who, or sort of medical staff who didn't want to enter the rooms, who kind of would just sort of leave food at the doors, and the sisters were often the ones who led by example, and they're sort of records from the hospital where they praise Sister Patrice and other Sisters of Charity for, not lecturing, but simply sort of going and doing what needed to be done and setting that example for everybody else. And also, kind of in addition, part of it that I didn't realize is the sisters were caring for the patients, but they also had to kind of provide spiritual counsel for the medical staff as well in the midst of that crisis, when sort of medical authority, you're trained to think that you can solve all, sort of cure all diseases, and medical science will win the day. And the AIDS crisis sort of brought about a great deal of frustration among medical authorities, because there was nothing that they could do. And so in some ways it was going back to the most basic elements of what medical care is, sort of corporal works of mercy, spiritual works of mercy, just being with people in their dying moments. But the sisters went around to the patients, but they also went around to, nurses in order to sort of talk with them about what they were experiencing. So that side of their counseling role, and this is all being done by sort of a handful of sisters who are in the hospital.
It's really, really amazing and beautiful story, really. I have another question, but I want to see if anybody else has a question, so I'm not going to ask it yet.
Anyone else?
Yes.
What, Monsignor?
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank
you are,
you.
Monsignor. Go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Rzeznik, thanks very much for your presentation. And I found what you were saying about St. Vincent's Hospital and the sisters as taking multiple roles as entrepreneurs, administrators, and so forth. Is there something similar that's been written about the Sisters of Charity and education, where they're all of their multiple contributions in education, similar to what you found in St. Vincent's? There's something similar, or does that work still have to be done?
There was always more work to be done, and I think sort of the answer to that is there are two ways that I can answer it. Both sort of this is, if I look specifically at the Sisters of Charity, their work in sort of education in the Archdiocese of New York. They were the largest teaching order within the Archdiocese. They staffed upwards of like 2/3 of the parochial schools in the Archdiocese of New York. So that was sort of a central part of their ministry, immense contributions. Partly there's a difference between sort of the sisters who are engaged in education, particularly parochial education, and the sisters in the hospital, simply because the sisters in parochial education, they did not own the parish schools. The parish did. The pastor sort of made decisions about the school, as opposed to the hospital, where the sisters were the hospital was incorporated. The sisters were the legal owners. The sisters were the board of managers. They were the ultimate authority there. The equivalent within the education sphere would be something like their private academy or the College of Mount St. Vincent. So there were some educational institutions that the sisters owned, but most of them were simply sort of the sisters staffed those schools. So in that way, the sisters, it's not a comparable story about authority. But even if you do look within education, there's a scholar at Iona College, Jim Carroll, who wrote one of the chapters for the Cambridge Companion. He wrote the chapter on Catholic education. And what his interest has been is looking at the sort of the Diocese of Brooklyn, which is separate from the Archdiocese of New York. For those of you who, it's weird, New York City has two, it's split between two dioceses. He looks at the religious communities in the Diocese of Brooklyn during the kind of what we would call the progressive era, and how the sisters, in addition to staffing the schools, were also incredibly influential in standardizing curriculum, in sort of doing what we would call sort of kind of educational administration, sort of through their roles as superintendents, assistant superintendents. So making sure that students had sort of similar curricula across the board. So sort of every child in second grade was going to be getting sort of a similar education. And so part of it, you can look at it as sort of like, oh, this is just like educational bureaucracy. You know, as we in higher education deal with standards and assessment and things like that, you know, in some ways they're creating that world. But it made sense at a time for a place like New York where you wanted standardized curricula because it made it easier for the students and it made it easier for the sisters or the teachers. So if the family moved a lot and they were going from one parish school to another, you knew that the curriculum would largely match up. You know, especially for things like, you know, not just for, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also for sacramental preparation, so that all students would be roughly the same place in their religious education. So they made sure that was it. So it helped for the transfer of students, but it also helped for sisters as you're trying to deploy your army of teaching sisters to staff all of these schools. If suddenly you have to shift a sister from one school to another, you know, somebody who's experiencing teaching fifth grade, this way she'd be able to teach the same fifth grade curriculum no matter which school she was sort of missioned to. So it's kind of interesting to think about that role of sisters in even though they didn't own the schools, the parochial schools, they were really influential in sort of creating the master plan for Catholic education when it came to curriculum. They were the ones who were involved in the National Catholic Education Association and sitting in those sort of national meetings, these discussions to ensure proper standards were met and to think about sort of to engage in pedagogical discussions. So, you know, they had an immense contribution. And I think that's one of the things that we haven't fully appreciated about their role. And so I'm glad that that gets some attention in the Cambridge Companion volume.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Elizabeth, you have more? Oh, Kathleen. Oops.
Hi, Kate Dodds. I wondered, in talking about your work with the Sisters of Charity at St. Vincent's Hospital in contrast to the volume itself, did women really kind of leap out from the volume? Because we're so used to thinking of Catholic tradition as sort of a male hierarchical history. Did their huge contribution in service areas, in the archives, for example, files on men religious are about 1 to 10 of the files on women religious. And Seton Hall itself, all of the priest faculty, all of the students were supported by 5 to 6 Sisters of Charity who ran the farm, harvested, cooked all the meals, did all the laundry, operated the infirmary. These 5 women cared for all of these men for years and years. So is it just numbers or the incredible service that they developed in the areas of education and healthcare and others as well?
Yeah, well, your comment about sort of the Sisters of Charity at Seton Hall, it's a reminder that sort of there was a presence of women at Seton Hall. It didn't just start when the college went co-ed. That's part of the story as well. Yeah, for the book itself, there's a way that we try to be mindful to weave in sort of the diversity of the Catholic experience across the chapters. there's a chapter dedicated to women religious. There's a chapter dedicated to lay women, but women religious also, they're the central actors in the chapter on education. They're central actors in the chapter on social welfare work. So they come up there. In a way too, things like there's the chapter on the kind of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And the early section is kind of a male story because those would have been the seminary professors, the theologians. But that author was mindful at the end to sort of talk about how Catholic theology has changed in the post-Vatican II era as women received formal training in theology, as they became sort of part of that conversation, and not just sort of white women, but Latino women and sort of Black Catholic theologians. And the volume can't single out their contributions to the extent that we wish, simply because it was brought, person gets 1,000 words to talk about that transformation, but it's there. And we hope that by seeing that as part of that story of the Catholic intellectual tradition, it will inspire people who want to learn more to go and look at the for further reading, or to develop sort of for students, that gives them an opportunity to develop a research agenda of their own to help flesh out those stories.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I feel like I have two not totally related questions. One is, you mentioned this, I can't remember what word you used, like backyard, Catholic people like interacting over the
Backyard
fences.
humanism.
Yeah. And I guess I'm interested in the immigrant experience of like Catholic families moving from those cities out into the country. And then I also wondered if there was any part of your book, I love teaching Father Massengale's racial justice in the Catholic Church, if that was any part. And then I also want to know about Dorothy Day. But I know I'm like that annoying student who's asking 3 completely different questions. Yeah. So whichever one you're most interested in addressing.
Well, I was going to say, there was sort of a bit of on Dorothy Day, there was a bit of a running joke that between me and my co-editor, that to sort of see how many chapters we're going to have Dorothy Day mentioned. So I'm looking at the index, and she gets 6 distinct citations because she's the person who pops up in the chapter on 20th century Catholicism, and then she pops up in sort of social welfare, and then she pops up in kind of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and then she she's kind of all over the place. Her story touches on so many different aspects. And it's Dorothy Day that's in there more than like, Cardinal Spellman of New York. She stands out. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I can't remember your exact question, but Dorothy Day certainly gets attention in there, in the way she could have been in sort of like almost every chapter. Racial justice, sort of, there's a chapter that's dedicated to Black Catholics. So certainly the story of the sort of desire for racial justice is part of it, but it's not specifically framed as that story of racial justice. Certainly it's sort of how Black Catholics have found their place in the church, have fought for recognition within the church, going back to the earliest days, from the founding of early Black parishes in places like Baltimore, the work of early Black religious communities like the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, or the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. They need to be part of the story. So yeah, kind of we wanted to make sure that we got, so there's this of racial justice, for those who are interested
in the backyard.
The backyard.
That's so helpful. Thank you. And then the last one was just what you mentioned. That was so interesting. I could just imagine that happening.
Well, I think like the chapter on Black Catholics is helpful, that if somebody's following kind of the racial justice moment today, and the work of Father Massengale, this chapter helps put it in perspective. And the author of that chapter on Black Catholics was very mindful to write the chapter from the Black Catholic perspective. It's not sort of white Catholics talking about Black Catholics. It's not the racial problem as defined by sort of white church leaders, talking about them over there. It's, sort of somebody who's trying to capture their internal conversations, who are, the figures that were advocating from within the tradition, going back to the earliest periods, the founding of groups like the Federation of Colored Catholics, talking about sort of like highlighting sort of the enduring presence of Black Catholics within the church, going back to somebody like Pierre Toussaint, in sort of New York City, kind of those sorts of stories. So it's helpful as that historical foundation for the current sort of current moment. I will say, just sort of as an aside, one thing I had in my notes for the challenges of the volume, one of the hardest things we had was trying to figure out what image to put on the front cover of the volume. Simply because, like, okay, you get one image that's going to somehow try and represent all of American Catholicism. And, there are lots of great ideas, but, if you choose one, it privileges one or perhaps discounts another part of the experience. The press, they got us started. They're the ones who sort of like, they had a design team. The first version that we got from the press suggested a mission church as sort of the foundations of American Catholicism, so a Spanish mission. And they sent us a mock-up of the cover and included this church, which my co-editor and I both sort of looked at their image and went, you know what? NYU Press has already used that image on their book on American Catholicism. So let's not use that one. Which then led to sort of a long discussion of like, well, should we put women, maybe some women religious on the cover? Maybe, try and find a sort of a current picture of people in the pews that would show the diverse face of American Catholicism. St. Patrick's Cathedral, all of these, there are so many possibilities. There's sort of a richness of Catholic material culture, a richness of Catholic archival material. And so in the end, we sort of went with kind of the abstract, something that perhaps is evocative of religion and Catholicism with some stained glass. But this is the cathedral in San Francisco, California. So kind of, you can see at the very bottom, you can see the pews and the altar. But this is sort of going up into the, it's not a dome, but the kind of the sort of the ceiling, the elevated part of the cathedral. And they're stained glass, and on one side it's a little bit red, and the other side's a little bit blue. So maybe that sort of hints at a little bit of sort of polarization and divide within the Catholic Church, but that was not kind of our intent with the image. It was basically trying to find an image that kind of didn't privilege perhaps one group over another, a Spanish mission church, a Gothic cathedral, an Italianate design, sort of what structure speaks for everybody. And I was inspired, sort of I gravitated towards the cathedral in San Francisco because a few years ago I was in California on a conference, and I went to, it was in San Jose, but I drove around California and I visited the new cathedral, or relatively new cathedral in Los Angeles, the new cathedral in Oakland, and they're all modernist spaces, which is very different from the kind of the Gothic or the Romanesque style that we've had that's more common here on the East Coast and other parts of the country. And I thought it was very interesting that, it's a place of the country where the Catholic population is incredibly diverse, and they're trying to find an architectural style that doesn't privilege any one group. They didn't want a Spanish style. They didn't want a European style. So modernist architecture sort of became the architectural vernacular that they chose. So I think that was kind of sort of interesting and on my mind when we were discussing the cover. But Nancy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I guess this is going to have to be the last question because our time is just about up. But this came up at a core meeting the other day. When did people start talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition and using that phrase? And nobody at the meeting really knew the answer to that, even people that are quite well versed in this sort of thing. And I'm hoping, I have a feeling you might know.
Oh, that's a good question. I cannot pinpoint when when that term came up. I think to some extent it involves, some searching, for that exact phrase. And when does it start showing up in scholarship? Like, what does Google Books tell us as they search through pages for that exact phrase? Yeah, so I think I'm gonna have to sort of do the professor. So like, that's a really great question. I'll have to look into it and get back to you for the next class.
Well, listen, I think if anybody will find it out, it's you. Because none of us could answer that question. I think somebody said, well, I think it's like was in the 1800s, but nobody seemed to be really sure when that came into.
But I mean, so my guess is that, well, maybe somebody did use it early on. For them, it was just Catholicism. That's what they spoke about. But there's really that kind of idea of a Catholic intellectual tradition is emerging in like the 1970s, 1980s, at the same time as people like Andrew Greeley are talking about the Catholic imagination. They're trying to figure out what is something distinctive about Catholicism. What are these enduring sort of intellectual legacies, cultural legacies? As you're trying to think about Catholicism as not simply institutional affiliation, that you are baptized, like that was the defining element of what made you Catholic, that it's something else. It's sort of Catholics think differently. They sort of see the world differently. So this Catholic intellectual tradition, this Catholic imagination is a way of trying to describe a phenomenon. And so I wonder if there is sort of a moment where that idea of a Catholic intellectual tradition gains currency in that moment.
Well, maybe we'll do another one next year, and you'll have another book coming out, and we will pursue. I'm sure you'll have the answer to the question by then. But thank you so much, Dr. Rzeznik. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It was a pleasure to be with you. Enjoy spring break, people, and look forward to the next gathering. Nancy, do you want to do a plug? Do we know when the next one is?
Well, the next one is going to be Elizabeth, but we realized just today, just like about an hour ago, that we have a conflict. We have another event that's so Elizabeth, I haven't even had a chance to reach out to you yet because we were going right into this, but it's going to be coming up in March, and we'll have to confirm with Elizabeth, but it's going to be on her wonderful book from Oxford University Press. So we are really starting off with a bang with Cambridge and Oxford and our just showing what amazing faculty we have. So thank you so much, Tom. That was a really rich discussion, and I enjoyed every minute of it. So happy spring break, everybody. And I know I'll see some of you, but not everybody. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Spring break, everybody.
Take care.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy, we'll find another time. Just email me.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so sorry because we realized there was a conflict. And the other thing, I don't know what was scheduled first, but I think we don't want to have a competing audience.
No, that's fine. Anytime, I teach Mondays and Wednesdays, 11 to 3:15.
Okay.
Any other time when I don't have a Friday meeting is fine.
So we're thinking of maybe the following Wednesday, the 23rd, if
Great.
That works for you.
I'm just gonna put it in my date book, and if you guys have to change it, that's fine. But like, if I don't write it down,
I know that's the same
it's
with me.
gone.
Thank you so much for being flexible. The other person was an outside person, so all right.
It would be the 21st at 4.
The 23rd, a Wednesday.
I'm
it's a
sorry, the
Wednesday
23rd, that Wednesday.
at 4. Yeah,
At
we just
4.
move it to the
Yeah,
following week.
that's great. Okay, I'm writing it down right now.
Thanks
Thanks,
so much,
Nancy.
Elizabeth.
See you later.
Happy
Bye.
spring. Bye-bye.
Thanks.